Hello, my name is Jim Genzano. I'm the man behind the camera on this channel. I usually do Lego build videos, and I did a couple of Garbage Pail Kids videos, but I'm also a writer, and I wanted to take the opportunity to get in front of the camera and read you a chapter from my new book. It's called Tree and Beast, A Stranger World Adventure. It's the first book in a series of six middle grade fantasy novels. Very excited to get it published. I've been working on it a long time. I hope people will enjoy it. So I'm going to read for you now chapter 4 from the book to catch you up with the story thus far in the book. It's a story about a 11-year-old boy named Hunter Wilson, and all he's ever wanted to do is find a monster. So at this point in the story, he is about to meet a monster. He climbs through a tree behind his school into another world, a magical forest full of little magical creatures, and he meets a raven who's much smarter and more talkative than your average raven. And the raven tells him that a monster is coming to eat him right now. And the raven's way of helping is to tell a story to Hunter about the monster. It's basically the origin story of the monster. So that's where we pick up with chapter 4 is Raven telling the story to Hunter. So here we go. Once, the raven said, and the forest seemed to hush itself even further, as if everything in it had stopped to listen. Time slowed, even more than it already had as Hunter had walked through the wood, and the light shifted so that everything was dimmed except the raven on his branch, who sat now in a spotlight. Once, long, long ago, when the world was so young that it was really a different world altogether, there was a woman who was a farmer, and she had 3 children. The first child, a son, grew up tall and strong and clever, and when he came of age, he said to his mother, "I'm leaving now to seek my fortune. I shall become a rich merchant." So she gave him her blessing, and he took the best horse the farmer owned, a fine, strong cart horse, and he rode away. After many adventures that don't come into this tale, he did become a rich merchant, just like he'd said, and he sent back money and exotic gifts from far-off lands to his siblings and his mother, and they were very proud and happy, and so the farmer and her family prospered. The farmer's second child, a daughter, grew up just as tall and strong and clever as the first child, and when she came of age, which was not long after her elder brother, she said to her mother, "I'm leaving now to seek my fortune. I shall become a wise magician." At first the farmer objected. She had hoped her daughter would stay and run the farm after her, and she thought surely they had enough now, and that there was no need to seek further fortune. But over time the daughter wore her mother down with strong, thoughtful arguments. She was very smart, but her studies were limited, living as she did on a farm with only a small town nearby. She needed to go out into the world to learn more and fulfill her potential. So at last the farmer gave her daughter her blessing, and she took the second best horse the farmer owned, a decent brown plow horse, and she rode away. After many adventures that don't come into this tale, some stories crisscross, you know, she did become a wise magician, just like she'd said, and she sent back gold and beautiful totems carved with the most powerful runes to her sibling and her mother, and they were even more proud and happy and prosperous than before. The farmer was just about as pleased as she could be. The farmer's third child, a son, did not grow up quite so tall, or quite so strong, or quite so clever as his siblings. He was a bit of a runt, really, and rather ugly, and stubborn as a mule. But he was constant and true and determined. When he came of age, which was not long after his older siblings, he said to his mother, "I'm leaving now to seek my fortune. I shall become a great king." Well, how she laughed at him. "Don't be silly," said the farmer. "We have everything we need now, thanks to your brother and your sister. Why don't you stay at home and look after the farm? You're a good boy and I love you, but you might become ill on the road or get lost or hurt, and then where would we be?" But the third child was adamant. He dug in his heels and wouldn't budge. He would have his way. He would go to become a great king. Because you see, one can crave escape, even from love and safety. Ain't that right, kid? And the raven turned his head to stare at Hunter with that beady, penetrating eye, as black as night, and the boy shifted uncomfortably and looked around, wondering if the monster might come soon, and kind of hoping it would. So, the raven continued, shifting his perch on the branch a bit, finally, the third child wore his mother down, and, grudgingly, she gave him her blessing, and he took the third best horse, which was a spotted, gray, broken-backed old nag, and he rode away. Well, pretty much right away, before he'd got even a mile from home. The horse fell over and died. So the third child sat down by the crossroads and wept, and wondered what he was going to do now. Just at that moment, a tall, well-dressed man came down the road from the other direction, and though the third child did not recognize him, he was quite naive in the ways of the world. This man was really the Gruagach of tricks. The raven said this as if it were obviously deeply meaningful, so although Hunter wanted to ask who that was, he didn't feel like he could, and anyway, the bird didn't give him a chance. The Gruagach, the raven went on, without seeming to notice Hunter's confusion, looked down at the third child sitting there crying by the dead carcass of his horse, and asked him what his troubles were. So the third child poured his heart out, and told the stranger all about how he had set out to become a great king, and how things weren't going well so far. Listen then, the Gruagach said, with a kind smile, if you will swear to be loyal to me, like a son to a father, and stay with me, so that in a year and a day you are still standing by my side, I will see that you become a great king. Well, the third child couldn't believe his luck, and he swore to the Gruagach right then and there to do just as he said. Remember, the boy wasn't all that smart. And the Gruagach nodded and smiled a kind smile, and right away he hurried off at such a tremendous rate of speed that it was a thing to see. He outpaced the wind. With a step he had gone from one hilltop to the next hilltop, and with a leap he'd gone a league, and before you could snap your fingers, he was completely out of sight. Well, the third child was just about ready to sit down and cry again, because how could he possibly be by the well-dressed man's side in a year and a day if he'd already lost him in the first minute? But then he saw that in his haste, the well-dressed man had dropped a book and left it behind him as he fled. And the third child took up the book and read it and studied it from cover to cover, and before long he found he knew how to track better than any man or animal alive. So he set out after the Gruagach. He traveled for 6 months, following the scant signs the Gruagach left him. He didn't have time to shave, so he let his hair grow out, and eventually he grew a thick coat of fur all over his body, which was good because he was heading north and it was getting colder, and his clothes had become ragged and dirty. He hadn't had time to wash, you see, and he'd had to throw them away. He was so often going along near the ground to sniff for scents and check for bent blades of grass and broken twigs that he became used to it, and he started to crawl around on all fours all the time. There was little time to stop for food, so he would eat the sweet berries he found along the way, or hunt the animals that crossed his path, as if he himself were an animal, running them down and biting them with his teeth and scratching them with his claws. His nails had grown quite long and jagged, until they died. For a while he cooked them over a fire before he ate them, but making the fire and doing the cooking took a long time, and he needed every second he could spare to catch up with the Gruagach, so that he could be by his side when the year and a day ended. So eventually he stopped cooking them at all and ate them raw. He didn't know it, but if anyone living in the villages that he passed saw any sign of him, they assumed he was a werewolf or a demon, and shut themselves in their houses until he was gone, offering up prayers to their various gods. At the end of the 6 months, finally the third child had tracked the Gruagach to a snow-covered valley. In the middle of the valley was a great tower. The third child had nearly caught up with the Gruagach when he dashed into this tower and shut the door. When the door shut, it disappeared, and there was only smooth wall all around, without a window or even the slightest chink to be found anywhere, except that the keyhole that had been in the door still remained, just sitting there in the middle of the stone. The third child was about to start pounding on the walls in frustration, when he found that the Gruagach had again, in his haste to escape, dropped a book on the ground and left it behind him as he fled. The third child took up the book and read it and studied it from cover to cover, and before long he found he was able to shrink himself down as small as the head of a pin, and at that size he easily leapt through the keyhole and entered the tower. Of course, almost before he'd gotten inside the tower, the Gruagach had left out a back door that appeared when he called for it, and disappeared again as soon as he'd gone through it. And this time, having apparently learned from his previous mistake, he left no keyholes behind. Even the one on the front door, through which the third child had just entered, had now vanished. The tower was completely sealed up, without the slightest hint of a crack anywhere, not even a crack big enough to fit someone as small as the head of a pin. And the third child was sealed up inside of the tower, in complete darkness, just as tight and as final as if he were in his own tomb. And in fact, as the third child quickly realized, since there was only a limited amount of air in the tower now, it would indeed very likely be his tomb. The third child went to sit down and have a good cry again, but as he did, he stumbled over something in the dark. It seemed that in the Gruagach's haste to escape, he had dropped a book on the ground and left it behind him as he fled. The third child took up the book and strained and squinted for an entire day until he taught himself to see in the dark as well as any owl, and once he'd done that, he read the book and studied it from cover to cover, and before long he found he was able to grow as large as he liked, even as large as an elephant, even as large as a giant, and when he'd grown as large as that, the tower fell to pieces around him as if it were made of nothing but cards. Then he returned to his normal size and set out after the Gruagach again. He traveled for 6 months, just as before, but moving day and night now, since he could see as well in the light as in the dark, eating more animals and more sweet berries, and frightening more villagers, his coat growing thick and matted, his tracking and hunting skills becoming ever greater, his muscles and his jaws growing stronger and stronger, and his claws growing sharper and more deadly, until there was nothing that could escape him under sun or moon. At the end of the 6 months, finally the third child had tracked the Gruagach to a snow-covered mountaintop. When he caught up with him at the top of the mountain, it had been exactly a year and a day since they had first met. The Gruagach turned to him and smiled his kind smile. "You have kept our bargain," he said, "and in the process made of yourself a thing of greatness indeed, and so I crown you King of Monsters." And he set a crown made of ice on the third child's head. Then he turned into a great black raven and flew away, leaving no books of any kind behind him. Hunter continued to stare at the raven for quite a while before it finally dawned on him that the bird had stopped talking. Time began again. A breeze blew by, and the tree's branches shook. The light shifted back, the spotlight dimming. The raven could almost have been a normal bird, sitting there, waiting for some imperceptible cue to flutter off and do normal bird things somewhere else. Are you the Gruagach of tricks?" Hunter said quietly. "No," the raven answered. He paused. Then he added, "Not at the moment, anyway." "What is that supposed to mean? You either are or you aren't." The raven ruffled his feathers in an irritated way. "Ridiculous! Preposterous! Haven't you been listening to the story I was just telling? Why, you're suggesting a person is just one person and remains that person for their whole life." "Well, aren't they? Don't they?" "Certainly not. Well, except for that one guy. But he's a special case. The point is, your average person turns into a different person practically every second, never mind from day to day, shedding all their skin and growing a fresh layer, like a change of clothes, forgetting old things and remembering new, leaving friends behind to make others. Take you, for instance. Why, you're not at all the same person who came into this forest just an hour or so ago." The raven stared into him again, with that beady little eye. "Speaking of, just who are you, anyway?" Hunter opened his mouth to answer, and to ask the raven how he knew how long Hunter had been in the forest, and if he'd been watching him the whole time, and what exactly he was talking about when he said people changed into different people moment to moment, and what point he'd been trying to make by telling that horrible story. But he didn't get a chance to ask any of those questions, because just then there was a great rumbling and crashing and creaking, as if an earthquake was bounding through the forest towards them. This went on for a few moments, getting louder and louder and stronger. Then it stopped as quickly as it had started. Something huge and hairy was now standing at the edge of the circle of deep dark under the trees, its yellow eyes glowing. And that's the end of Chapter 4. I hope you liked it. The book, like I said, is called Tree and Beast: A Stranger World's Adventure. It's available now on Amazon in ebook or paperback. There will be a link in the description to take you there. I hope you buy it. I hope you like it. Thanks very much for listening.